Hello once again, everyone, and welcome to the kind of final of this series, this is also probably going to be one of the longer ones. We're going to now talk about Position 4. Now, Position 4 has no standardized equipment, and the best way to think, and generally, no armor. It's not that you won't find people in Position 4 that might have something, but we're talking about pretty much nothing. And these people, their job is specifically 4+, is meant to either be extras of 1, 2, and 3, generally it's going to be extra 3s, or alternatively to be a purpose-built skirmisher. So because non-standard equipment, you may see all sorts of things, so I'm just going to kind of go through some general considerations as well as talk about a little bit of rule modification that is happening this year. I will put a write-up of it in more detail soon. But generally speaking, if you have absolutely no armor but can turn up with a spear, great, you are a perfect 4. In particular, if you have a shorter spear, you're not going to want to stand in the front rank, but you could probably do a lot of good just being ready to jump in wherever you need to. Certainly you could trade out with a 3 or things along those lines as they die. If you've got a longer spear and you can just show up with 2 longer spears, you may be put into a 3 slot with someone else, as you know, we'll have to make the block as strong as possible. But in individual scenarios, you can fight as a 3. It's just a good thing to turn up with your spear, whatever sidearm you're carrying, no armor. That's not a bad fighter. You are a purpose-meant skirmisher. You have a decent chance with a decent little weapon, and you can do okay. Another thing to consider, at least as far as polearms go, is this year we're doing things just a little bit differently. Last year, these Volges, which are quite light, they served also as armor killers, and mostly based upon how they ended up landing, I wasn't necessarily satisfied with that. Like I talked about in Position 2, if it's on a long enough haft, it doesn't matter what kind of head you're swinging, it's going to end up as an armor killer. But for these, I'm inclined to give them more of a light weapon sort of purpose. Now, what would these do? These would be what allows you to kill mail, basically. So if you run up against someone who's in nothing, you're not cutting at them, you can just thrust them. But if you end up running against someone who is in a mail shirt, this won't kill plate, but this will get through mail. So that does give you some options, basically. So if you're standing in the back, serving as a 4, and some decently armored skirmisher comes around, no longer are you, screwed with thrust only. You now do have an option as for sort of a mid-range fighter. We're going to do some more testing and see whether or not we're happy with that. You'll know well ahead of time, but the heads in particular that I'm looking for is stuff like this. It's on a slightly more dense shaft, but not nearly as heavy as some of the other heavy weapons. And if you show up with one and it's a little bit too heavy, then I'll designate it as a heavy weapon. This will be a case-by-case basis. But something that is, only maybe a little bit or about the same height as you, and on the lighter side, that's okay to cut at mail. It doesn't land all that heavy. You could spar with these in just normal fencing gear and be okay. But generally speaking, if you're not going up against armor, you want to be using it the same as a short spear. So that is an option that I expect to see a couple of Position 4s maybe carrying, as it does give them a little bit more versatility. Something else on the polearm side that I would not be surprised if we saw some more of. Now this was in the original write-up of the rules too, but as far as two-handed weapons of the more medium variety, here I've got a pair of different Dane axes. This one is made by Descendant Leather. This one is an Arkham axe head that has been put on a haft. These won't kill armor. They don't kill mail. They don't kill plate, but they act the same as a longsword, i.e. it's a two-handed cut. So gambesons, that is not something you need to care about. And while that isn't necessarily great for if I go up against someone armored, just the nature of having something a little bit more extended that can hook and drive and things along those lines has shown itself to be quite useful for a lighter armored person to carry, as it gives you a little bit more versatility, etc., and things along those lines. Your biggest danger, though, is that if you're carrying something like this, i.e. a Dane, Spartax, whatever you want to call it, you don't have much armor killing capability. You can absolutely, you're king of the unarmored, right? But you're not necessarily all that great when it comes to fighting armored foes. Now another thing that you might see is you might see Position 4s carrying a longsword or things along those lines, since they don't necessarily need to worry about carrying multiple weapons, maybe a dagger in combination with any of the things I've talked about above. Carrying a longsword is not necessarily the worst idea. It gives them pretty good versatility. Most people train longsword. It gives you the thrust option of maybe you can kill armor, though of course being unarmored yourself, if you end up close to the armor guy, you should be running away, but it's an all-round pretty good weapon, so as all of you know. So I wouldn't be surprised to see a couple people carrying that. it's not a bad thing to start off with. And certainly if you show up and all you can bring is yourself and maybe a synthetic longsword, you can find a polearm pretty easily and this can become your backup. But as a 4, it's not necessarily the worst thing for a main arm if you're playing as a skirmisher. Now, the other kind of big option that 4s get is, since they are dedicated light armor, you can start looking into things like shields. Now, an important thing to remember is that when you are carrying a shield, you have a very important limiting factor. Number 1, generally speaking, most of us to get our hands into a shield, be that a buckler or a rotella or a targe, these are all being allowed, you generally have a lighter glove on your left hand, meaning you can't just ditch this and keep fighting. You would have to put a heavy on if you put the shield down, which means, and not to mention generally, it's pretty hard to get rid of one of these if you need to. So in some situations, having a shield may be valuable. In others, having a shield may be a hindrance. And certainly you've got to make that decision. If you want to show up and be a dedicated carrying a shield person, 1, you are not going to be in the front rank, that's what armor's for. But 2, you have your place. Certainly if you can combine it with, maybe you show up with a short spear and shield. We saw this as like the standard skirmisher for a long time. You would be pretty good at dealing with other lightly armored infantry, as well as being pretty mobile and being decently protected as long as you can use it. Now, again, you are limited now by the fact that you are carrying that shield. So bear in mind, if you end up being forced in a position where you have to stand in the front rank, this shield, while you can use it, is not all that useful. So that means if you're carrying something like a spear, you're probably stuck with overhand grip, underhand grip, single-hand style thrusting. But if you want to play that route as a 4, you can. Now, another thing you might commonly see though is just going ahead and going full sword board. Certainly we had a couple people who tried it out. Now there will be some scenarios where if we have enough polearms and probably have enough people, I will not allow shields for them just to encourage certain things. But this will have its place in the battlefield eventually, either during the bad war scenario or during other more open scenarios once everyone's really in the game. So you'll start seeing things like this, wherein you have, again, light, dedicated skirmishers that go and do light infantry style things. Now one more thing I wanted to talk about is one of the newer additions that, again, I expect to see more of, and I'll be talking more about this in the coming days, is carrying a hand axe. Certainly, in regards to all of the groups I've talked about so far, all the different positions, any of them could carry one of these as a sidearm. The rule that we're working with is this doesn't kill mail. This, because it is an axe compared to a sword, it can kill a gambeson. So if I run up on someone with a gambeson and I'm using this, and I throw a one-handed cut, and I hit that gambeson, they don't care. If I stab them, they die. If I manage to, and we have seen this happen on rare occasion, get 2 hands on it with a nice structured cut, that'll get through. That, again, doesn't necessarily happen all the time. Generally, it's, you're using a one-handed weapon, you're using it one-handed. If you're carrying an axe like this, though, you kind of give up a lot of good opportunity. Not much defensive options with this, but on the plus side, now if you hit a gambeson, you can put it down. Obviously, you're playing nicely, but you can't kill mail, like, at all, because there's not really a point to thrust with, and certainly not enough to get through mail. So if you're carrying this as a sidearm, it's mostly for its pure convenience in regards to how easy it is to carry. It's not terribly complicated to use, but it's not going to do you much good in certain scenarios. So these are on the table now, especially because we have a couple and I've got a couple more on the way. That's really their role, is it's just a slightly different alternative to the single-handed sword. But otherwise though, like I said, position 4 is about being non-standard. It's, you don't want to play as a 3 and or we have enough people that we need 4s. You can certainly just be another 3 as a 4, that's just fine. Or alternatively, be kind of the weapons cat. There's nothing wrong with, as a position 4, standing there if weapons allowed, holding multiple pieces ready to hand them off if something goes wrong. Or alternatively, switching weapons with whoever trades out in front of you, as long as you can take their position armor-wise. And they're certified to grab a poleaxe, for example. That can be a very useful thing to do. For the most part, your job is visibility, mobility, and just being light infantry and useful where you can be. But otherwise though, that concludes all of the lance positions, at least the dedicated ones. You just then multiply out, you may have a 4 that looks more like a 3 or what have you. But Beyond that, that's kind of what you should be looking at and asking yourself is, either you're coming alone or with a team, what of those do you have the capability to play as, do you want to play as, and start thinking about what kit you want to be carrying. Will you get to use it all? Not necessarily, but it is worth considering what you want to be using, because that's the tools you'll be carrying for a lot of the scenarios. And certainly the more open scenarios will give less standard equipment more time to shine, depending on what they're doing. Otherwise though, thank you very, very much for watching. I look forward to seeing you at the event. We'll go over some other Yeehaw stuff another time.